the girl went for a bike ride in the park and disappeared without a trace. From the first hours, this case attracted the attention of all residents of the city, since this was not the first such case in their area. The search for the truth lasted for 3 decades, and only recently detectives managed to solve this mystery. But what they found out shocked literally everyone, because no one expected such a turn. Jennifer Bastian was born on April 15, 1973 in Chicago. The girl had loving parents and an older sister, with whom she was very close. They later moved to Tacoma, located near Seattle. From an early age, Jennifer was actively involved in various sports. When the girl was 13, her father gave her a new bicycle. Jennifer immediately decided that she didn't just want to ride it around the city, but to achieve some success in cycling. Later she learned that a cycling tournament would be held soon and decided to take part in it. This was a fairly serious event, which was held on Sanjuan Island near the Canadian border. The girl understood that she would have to compete with experienced cyclists and began to actively prepare. At that time, the girl was on vacation, so she devoted almost all her time to training. Jennifer rode her bike almost every day, riding more than 10 kilometers at a time. One of her friends also decided to take part in a cycling tournament, and they constantly trained together. The girl lived next to a huge park, which had a circular path about 8 kilometers long. It was a great place for training. Most often he and his friend went there. Monday, August 4, 1986. Jennifer spent the first half of the day at home with her mother. After lunch, the woman left for work on the evening shift, and her daughter was getting ready to go to the park with a friend. However, she had other things to do, and she told Jennifer that she could not keep her company. Despite this, the girl decided not to miss the training. She called her father and asked permission to go alone. The man agreed and told her to be home by 7:30 in the evening. Jennifer left a note for her mother and left the house at about 3:30. The father returned home around 8:30 in the evening. To his surprise, he did not find his daughter there. He walked around all the rooms and looked outside, hoping that the girl might be tinkering with her bike in the garage, but she was nowhere to be found. Then he immediately called his wife, who rushed home, and they contacted the police. They quickly began searching for Jennifer, starting to comb the entire territory of the park. This was complicated by the fact that it was huge, and most of it was occupied by forest. In addition, it was starting to get darker outside, which created even more difficulties. Meanwhile, officers interviewed park visitors and urged anyone who saw Jennifer to contact them. Rather, they found first witnesses. These were 3 guys who studied at the same school with the girl. They said that they saw her at about 16:10 when she was driving along the roundabout. The guys added that a man was riding a bicycle not far from her and gave him a rough description. However, this park was popular with Tacoma residents, and there were always many cyclists, runners, and other vacationers there. Therefore, the police were in no hurry to draw conclusions that this particular man might be involved in the disappearance. 2 more people said they saw Jennifer around 3 p.m. At approximately 11 o'clock, the police came to her mother, who was told to stay at home in case her daughter returned. They brought search dogs with them and asked to give them some of the girl's things so that the dogs could pick up her trail. Together with them, they continued to explore the park until late at night, but they could not find the girl. The police also decided to close the park to visitors for the next 3 days so that nothing would interfere with the search. Jennifer's disappearance has left local residents very frightened, and the police have been under intense pressure. There was a very serious reason for this. Just a few months earlier, another girl named Michaela was killed in another park, and now people thought that there was a serial maniac under their noses. Michaela's murder and Jennifer's disappearance had obvious similarities. The girls were about the same age, and were also in parks and on bicycles. In addition, the parks were located in the same area, with less than 6 kilometers between them. Investigators and Jennifer's relatives continued to hope that this was all just a coincidence and that the girl could be found alive. However, every day these hopes became more and more elusive. The detectives understood that it was highly likely that she was the victim of the same person who killed Michaela and continued to comb the park in search of her. Despite all the efforts of the police and volunteers, over the next few weeks the girl could not be found. On August 28, 24 days after Jennifer disappeared, her mother decided to repaint the walls in the house as a way to take her mind off these thoughts that were weighing her down. At the same time, a detective came to her and shared the tragic news. The girl's body was found in the same park. She was not far from the path along which Jennifer was skating. It was discovered by a man who went there for a run. On the way, he suddenly smelled a strong corpse odor and reported it to the police. The girl's body lay under a large number of branches and leaves. The police assumed that the criminal had prepared this place in advance, since it would have taken a long time. Her bicycle was found a few meters away. It was also covered with branches. Medical experts determined that the victim died as a result of strangulation. She was also subjected to violence, but this time no biological samples of the criminal were found on her body. After finding Jennifer, the police became even more convinced that they were dealing with a serial killer. Despite the fact that they had no hard evidence and DNA was of no use in those years, detectives made every effort to find a culprit. They understood that this man could strike again at any moment and tried to prevent this. They began researching information about other similar crimes in Tacoma, and soon became interested in one particular case. In 1970, a 13-year-old girl disappeared without a trace, and 3 months later her body was found in the forest. During the investigation, it turned out that she was killed by a 29-year-old man named David Fisher, who worked in a pet store. The girl went there regularly, and Fisher gradually won her trust. Taking advantage of the fact that she loved animals very much, a man once told her that monkeys would soon be brought to him, which he would have to train. Fisher invited the girl to help him in this matter, and she agreed. After this, the criminal raped her and killed her, burying her bodies in the forest. He was soon caught and sent to prison, but after 3 years, the man achieved a transfer to a less secure institution due to exemplary behavior. In essence, this institution was a farm where prisoners were subject to virtually no restrictions. As a result, Fisher simply left there, because there was not a single fence there. Since then, the police could not find him, and after the murders of Michaela and Jennifer, they began to think about his possible involvement. Since the choice of victims and the details of the crimes were very similar. In addition, psychologists who worked with Fisher unanimously argued that he was highly likely to start killing again. However, Fisher could not be found for 16 years, and detectives also could not get closer to catching him. In addition, many police admitted that the man had long ago moved as far as possible from Tacoma, and would unlikely have started committing new crimes here. Since then, these cases have completely frozen. The police investigated other possible suspects and processed thousands of tips, but made no progress. A few years later, when DNA analysis was already in full use by the police, they checked the semen sample from Michaela's body against the databases, but there were no matches. This continued until 2011, when the Tacoma Police Department created a cold case unit. The detective in charge began searching for employees, and soon drew attention to a woman named Lindsay Wade. She worked in the police for a long time and achieved outstanding results. She was invited to join the cold case unit and immediately accepted the offer. The woman said that the murders of Jennifer and Michaela greatly affected her life. At that time, she was 11 years old, almost like these victims. In addition, Lindsay lived in the same area with them. Since then, she could not forget about it, and ultimately decided to go to the police herself. Her goal was to find the killer of these girls, and after 27 years, Lindsay began this task. Since then, she devoted all her time to these matters. The woman visited crime scenes, reread every report, and examined all the evidence. She decided to collect the names of absolutely all the men who had even the slightest connection to the investigation. The list included all witnesses and people who were in the park on the day of the murder, as well as those who called the police and shared tips. In addition, there were other criminals who lived in Tacoma. The process took Lindsay several months, and she ended up with a list of 2,300 names. The problem was that searching for the killer among so many people was extremely problematic, so the woman decided to try something else. She resent all the evidence to the laboratory. In 1986, experts examined only Jennifer's body, since technology did not allow them to look for microscopic evidence, for example, on clothing. And in those years, this did not make much sense, since DNA analysis was not yet used. But this time, experts examined the swimsuit that Jennifer was wearing that day, and they were able to find traces of male semen on it. Experts isolated a DNA sample, and everyone was in complete shock. It did not match the semen sample found on Michaela's body. None of the detectives expected such a turn of events. Everyone was sure that the same person was behind the murder, but this turned out not to be the case. Jennifer and Michaela died at the hands of two completely different men. The news also came as a shock to the victims' relatives and left detectives with a new challenge. Now they had to find two killers at once. Of course, first of all, the sample from Jennifer's swimsuit was entered into the database, but there were no matches. However, Lindsay did not even think about despair. She contacted one of the leading experts in the field of DNA research, Callan Fitzpatrick. She was doing genetic genealogy. Lindsay asked her to help with this matter. The essence of genetic genealogy is that experts can try to identify the owner of DNA through his relatives, using all available DNA databases. Thanks to modern scientific discoveries, they can discover even the most distant relationships, moving ever closer to the owner of the DNA. Ultimately, experts can find several thousand of his relatives, after which they will have to study each of them and build family ties in an attempt to identify the identity of the person they need. Callan took up the case and provided a list of possible distant relatives of the DNA owner. However, this did not help the detectives much. They studied the people on the list, but were no closer to catching the killers. The experts also failed to find closer relatives of the criminals available in the databases. Linksir also turned to Parabon, a company known for making rough portraits of people based on their DNA. Despite the fact that the results of their work are not always accurate, they often do manage to reflect similar people in the images. The company provided the detective with portraits of DNA holders, and they were soon published with a request for help identifying these people. The police received a huge number of tips, but they all led investigators to a dead end. Lindsay then decided to review her list of 2,300 men and try to weed out those whose involvement in the murders seemed least likely. As a result of this work, she left only 160 names and decided to try to get DNA samples from each of them. The task was very difficult, since 30 years had already passed since the murders. Most of these people dispersed to different cities and states. Investigators began a long work. As a result, they managed to achieve their goal, and all people agreed to provide their samples voluntarily. After this, the police again faced a lengthy process. Their labs were busy with other work, so it was impossible to test all 160 samples at once. Lindsay sent samples to experts in small batches, several at a time. As a result, the process lasted for a year. Lindsay retired in 2018, but not before sending her final batch of 18 samples to the lab. The case was then transferred to a new detective, who began to wait for the results. 25 days later, that detective called her and told her he had a perfect match. A semen sample from Jennifer's swimsuit matched the DNA of one of the final 18 people selected from Lindsay's list. The killer turned out to be 60-year-old Robert Washburn. Lindsay recognized the name immediately, as Robert had been on the police report, and even before Jennifer's murder. He was the same person who told investigators that he had seen a man in the park who looked like a sketch of Michaela's killer. This happened 2 months before Jennifer's death, and she was later murdered in the very park that Robert himself pointed out. Detectives were greatly surprised by these results. They didn't really understand why Washburn had given the police this tip, which was most likely fake. He had nothing to do with Michaela's murder, but for some reason he pointed out to investigators another park where he would later kill Jennifer. If it wasn't for that, the man would never have been reported to the police, and no one would have come to him for a DNA sample. It is noteworthy that Robert provided it voluntarily, which helped to establish his involvement. Washburn had no criminal history before or after the murder. In 1986, he lived in the same neighborhood as Jennifer and worked for Boeing. A few years after the murder, he got married, and the couple had a daughter with a severe disability that required constant care. Soon Robert divorced his wife, and his daughter stayed with him. They moved to another state, settling in a small town, after which the man did not work anywhere and was only engaged in caring for his daughter. Immediately after his DNA matched the semen found on Jennifer's clothes, police arrested the man and extradited him to Washington State. For all his acquaintances, this was a real shock. Everyone considered Robert an exemplary father who devoted his whole life to caring for his daughter. Even his ex-wife said that he never showed any aggression and was always very calm. At the interrogation, on the contrary, he was visibly nervous. At first he was not told what exactly he was suspected of, and then Robert said, "I did not kill that girl." For the investigators, this was a good signal of his guilt, and even they did not need his confession. Considering that his DNA matched the semen on the victim's clothing, Robert had virtually no chance at trial. But the fact that the man immediately began to deny his involvement even before he was told why he was being detained spoke volumes. He continued to deny his guilt, but ultimately agreed to a plea deal. Robert admitted that he did indeed kill Jennifer. According to him, that day he was on the same path that the girl was driving. He stopped her, took her by the hand, and dragged her into the forest, where he killed her and hid her body. At the same time, the man did not admit that he had subjected her to violence, even though the seed on her clothes indicated this almost unconditionally. The man also turned to Jennifer's relatives and stated that he regretted his actions. However, none of them accepted his apology. As a result of the deal in January 2019, he received 26.5 years in prison, with the possibility of applying for early release after 20 years. Given his age, Robert may never leave prison. But the detectives' work didn't end there. For 30 years, they thought that the killers of Michael and Jennifer were the same person, but this turned out not to be the case. Back in 2018, detectives again contacted the Parabon Company, and this time asked to use genetic genealogy to find the owner of the DNA. Over the previous few years, this technology had progressed greatly, and after many months of work, experts were able to get closer to one family in which there were 2 brothers. They both lived in Tacoma at the time of Michaela's murder, and investigators were faced with the task of obtaining samples of their DNA. They took turns tracking both of them, and the first was 66-year-old Jerry Hartman. The police followed how he came to the hospital where he worked as a nurse, after which he and his colleagues went to a nearby cafe for lunch. There, the man used a napkin several times to wipe his mouth, and the police took it away immediately after he left. The evidence was immediately transferred to the laboratory, and soon the detectives received the long-awaited result. Hartman's DNA matched the semen found on Michaela's body. As a result, Jerry was arrested 40 days after Robert's arrest, and 32 years after Michaela's death. As in the case of Robert, all his friends and relatives were shocked. The man had no criminal history. He lived with his third wife, and seemed to be a decent citizen. Jerry refused to plead guilty, and his case went to trial. The trial began in 2022. and thanks to the presence of DNA, he was quickly found guilty. During the announcement of the verdict, Jerry began to cry loudly and ask for forgiveness from Michaela's relatives. But this did not help him avoid responsibility. The man was sentenced to 26.5 years in prison like Robert. True, he has much less chance of waiting until the end of the term. At the time of the trial, Jerry was 70, and during the trial he could not move around the courtroom without a walker. His lawyer also said that Jerry's parents gave him various pills from a very early age. He was also repeatedly abused and beaten, which is why Jerry's psyche was broken even as a teenager. According to the lawyer, the man was not aware of his actions and did not even understand for a long time that he had killed Michaela. However, all this did not force the judge to reduce his sentence. This ended two high-profile cases that for 30 years were considered one